Hi, Jan. Did you have trouble getting it connected to the audio?
Oh, no, just a bit of a technical issue with my other computer.
Oh, I see. I was starting to panic for you.
No, it's all right. I've just been,
Okay.
I was going to use the bigger computer, but it just was having a little bit of a hissy fit this morning. So
Okay.
I'm on my laptop. It's all good.
Right.
Thank you.
And we're just now waiting for Ian.
Yeah, we've just been chatting briefly. So
Okay.
he's getting himself ready. Yeah.
Right.
Good morning, everybody. I'm hoping you can hear me.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. From my end, I am having some microphone difficulties, so I will try and keep myself mostly muted. But good morning and thank you, everybody. We're reconvening the hearing. We have received ahead of time an updated landscape plan from the applicant, and we have received in writing commentary. Very good. Received in writing comment from Mr. O'Connell, including an updated statement from Mr. Denny relating to the new landscape plan. The intent this morning was to hear from the remaining officers that weren't able to speak at the hearing. And subject to any comments from any of you before we proceed, I was thinking it would be helpful, perhaps if Mr. Lecky's there. Hello, Mr. Lecky, I see you there.
Good morning. Yes, I'm here, sir.
Was to just introduce the new material that's been provided. Mr. O'Connell also made reference to the wastewater system perhaps being changed or addressed. So maybe you should just start by telling us where you've got to, and then Mr. O'Connell, we might turn to the officers, and unless anyone wants to give me another update and change that plan.
Excuse me, I'm not sure if anyone can hear me. I'm just having trouble with the sound at the moment. So can I just have a couple of seconds just to get my sound right? I'm just not sure what's going on here. Sorry.
We can hear you really well, Nathan.
Yeah.
You can hear me? Yeah, I'm just having trouble hearing you guys at the moment very well. So just, sorry, I'll just be 2 seconds.
I'll just pause.
No.
Mr. Lecky, while we're waiting for Mr. O'Connell to...
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
I can hear you now. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, terrific. Mr. Lecky, we were just going to get you to briefly update us on what's changed from your end since the hearing. While you're giving us that intro, it probably would be useful for you to just preempt a question I'm going to otherwise put to you, which is, when we get to the conclusion of hearing from the officers this morning, there's still a question of in what form and shape you were hoping to provide us with a reply. Are there any conditions of consent to be updated, that sort of thing? And I don't know what you were thinking to try and do this morning or provide to us separately. So you might as well just give us at least your thoughts on that too.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. And keen to do that, and it may evolve as the morning goes on. As a starting point, just to introduce the further material, and there's not a lot of it, which is good. There's an updated landscape stack that has been circulated, and I assume the commissioners and all the council staff have that in front of them. But the key plan that's changed is called the vegetation plan, and I apologise, the pages aren't numbered, but it's top right, it says vegetation plan. And I'll just pause while people get to that. It essentially is a revised vegetation planting plan for what has been described as the amenity planting area, and it's the area surrounded by, in a green outline on that plan. And what is amended here is more specificity and detail around the size and nature of the planting within that amenity planting area. And along with this plan is a condition of consent, which I'll leave to Mr. O'Connell to speak to, but that Mr. O'Connell and Mr. Edmonds have been working on around ensuring the longevity and protection and perpetuity of that planting. So that's the key landscape change is that amenity planting area with the planting around the the villas. The remaining landscape proposal, so the covenanted area to the northern and western side of the site remains as per the hearing. Then in terms of wastewater, there's no formal or no written additional material. Mr. Ryder for the applicant and Mr. Hopkins have had a discussion regarding some of Mr. Hopkins' questions around the disposal fields or proposed disposal fields for the on-site wastewater system. There's no change proposed to the system from what was discussed and examined at the first hearing. But Mr. Hopkins is now, well, my understanding from the feedback from Mr. O'Connell is Mr. Hopkins is now comfortable that is a feasible solution, but I'll leave Mr. O'Connell to speak to that from council's perspective. But yes, no change to what was proposed, just more discussion between those experts. Lastly, from the applicant's perspective, in terms of where I'd be keen, with leave of the commissioners, to head following today, there's been a lot of work on the conditions, but there is still some more to come, and we're likely to hear about that today. So just to signal, we've had an informal discussion with Mr. O'Connell, and it's likely that 2 weeks would be necessary and helpful to input final feedback from the council team for Mr. O'Connell to then work with Mr. Edmonds on those conditions. And I'd see that potentially as a sort of informal conferencing type scenario, perhaps with a joint statement on where things have got to with the conditions and what's agreed and maybe what's not. And I think 2 weeks would be plenty of time for that to happen, and that could align with me filing our written right of reply, which will respond to those conditions and the other points that came up in the initial hearing at the same time. So I'd be seeking 2 weeks from now broadly to do that. And then that would mean today we really just are focused on the council time to report, and then we could pause and do the remaining in writing. So just broadly where things are at from the applicant's perspective, but happy to take questions as well.
Yeah, look, thanks for that, Mr. Leckie. And suffice it to say, the suggestion of providing us conditions in writing was definitely the preferred solution than trying to address it with us right now without us having had a chance to see those, but they're not there in any event. So, and thanks for clarifying that wastewater question. We'll just get Mr. O'Connell to clarify that as well for us. Commissioner Cornter, did you have any questions regarding anything that Mr. Leckie just said? No. Very good. Thank you. Okay, look, thank you, Mr. Leckie. Mr. O'Connell, we'll turn to the officers. The first question I'd ask is, I'm not seeing Mr. Errington among the lineup, and he didn't speak to us at the hearing. Is there an update on that?
He's available, so he's available if you have questions for him. So he can join up. And also, just on that, I've made Mr. Hopkins available as well. He's available to 11 o'clock, just in case, because the wastewater issue now is resolved, just in case the Commission has some questions. Mr. Hopkins is available also.
What I think we might do is, I think we really do need Mr. Errington to confirm whether his opinion has changed in any way. I don't have any questions of him. Commissioner Cornter might, but at the very least, I think he needs to tell us whether his view is still what it was. Yes. I think Mr. Hopkins probably should join and just because we've had nothing in writing on it from them, we really do need him to verbally tell us the satisfaction he's reached vis-a-vis some conditions of consent, I expect, that haven't quite been put to us. And maybe we should just get those addressed first, and then we can talk to Mr. Denny.
Yes, okay. I'll just take a minute just to get those two people online. I've just tried to contact both Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Errington, and unfortunately they're not answering the phone at the moment. I asked them to be available from this time, so I'll keep trying. Apologies for that.
Nathan,
Yes.
I will email them. Did they have the link?
Yeah, I've emailed them the link as well, so they've got all
Okay,
that. So,
I'll try emailing and
apologies.
see how we get on. Okay.
yeah, I asked them to be available. But
Yep.
Thanks, Trish.
Okay, look, thanks, Mr. O'Connell. It's obviously you're not their parent, but clearly it's not very satisfactory that they're not available at a time clearly well advertised specifically for them to address us. But we can't probably take that much further other than recording a bit of dissatisfaction there. But what we should do usefully is keep things moving while we're here. And Mr. Denny, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh.
I can't see you, but I'm sure that won't detract from what you have to say.
No, I don't know why you can't see me, but I'm at the council office, so.
Right. Well, look, good morning, Mr. Denny. We had read the original reporting you prepared, and we've read the updated commentary you provided attached to Mr. O'Connell's most recent summary to us regarding the updated landscape plan. The first question for you is, as normally would have occurred at the hearing, is just get you to confirm your view that it has or hasn't changed, or changed to whatever extent it may have. Oh, hello, there we go. And then we can see what questions we have for you. So over to you.
Yeah, well, the addendum I sent through on October the 31st kind of summarises where I'm at. And just on that, right in that addendum, my assumption on the latest plan that's come through, just to be clear, it would be nice to get some clarification on this. In terms of amenity planning, that the trees shown in the amenity planning are additional to the green areas around them, which is also planted as well. I'm not sure that's the intent or not. And the other thing was the proposed plant 50 beech trees in there. Now, there was an earlier schedule, the application showed beech trees as hedging, and Mr. Skelton in his statement at the hearing also touched on hedging as well. I just want to be absolutely clear that the red beech trees are not supposed to be hedging. They're going to be grown as proper trees because it is a large tree. So that's the assumption on that comment I've sent through, is on that basis. So just to be clear on that. Apart from that, there's no other change.
Well, I think in terms of the assumption you've stated you've made about the beech trees, the applicant can simply confirm that or otherwise in its right of reply. But thank you for clarifying the approach you've taken in terms of how and what conclusion you've reached. You happy to take any questions from us?
Oh, of course, yes, far away.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. One of the, I'll start with just one, and then I'll ask Commissioner Corntor if she has any, and then we'll see what I have left. One of the things that I'm wrapping my head around is, how have you approached the question of assessing landscape and visual effects of the proposal? A, in terms of the environment as you see it, what's there now, but separate to that, and because it's a non-complying activity, we have to have regard to separate limbs of adverse effects in one hand, but also this idea of objectives and policies of the plan. And so I'm interested in understanding from your point of view, have you just looked at landscape visual effects as you see it, or have you also or separately considered this idea of the outcomes sought by the zone and the land use scale of buildings, size of buildings, landscaping around them, open space around them, extent of vegetation, etc., and the extent to which this activity is or isn't consistent with that? Or have you left that to Mr. O'Connell, really? Just sort of see where I'm going? Sorry, it's a very poorly constructed question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to assess it, I mean, I've got to have some sort of structure in terms of what landscape outcomes intended on the plan are. So I've used chapter 22 to guide me on that, which sets out all those, provisions and objectives they want to achieve. So that's kind of the base, I guess, you assess it under, and it's the same with any other zone. You've got to have some structure to formulate it against. And of course, I've looked at the site as it is and the context and what have you, but there's a lot of change to happen there yet. That's consented, has been developed, and there's a lot of change that has happened. So that's taken on board. And then I've also looked at the consent notice conditions attached to the title of the property, which also sets out certain parameters and what have you.
If we were to, for the time being, put the consent notice aside in terms of a comparison of what's best, if we were just to say put it to one side and just look to this application on its own, let's assume there was no consent notice as a contextual matter, would you still have reached the same conclusion you have as to the merits, or do you think it might not be something you were so opposed to?
That's a very difficult one, because if the consent notice is not in place, potentially the surrounding landscape may be different as well. That'd be part of a separate development, which didn't include this site as part of that context. So that potentially may be different as well. So it's kind of hard to put that into context. You're kind of stuck with what you got. But I'm fully aware that they're proposing to deviate from what's under the consent notice conditions. And so revert back to the district plan and what its objectives are. So that's kind of, to me, that's the foundation of what needs to be delivered. So in terms of my assessment, I have looked at the consent notice conditions and where it meets that and where it doesn't, but I've also had to go back to the district planning framework in terms of what's the outcome we achieved for that.
Yeah, I didn't really understand where you went there, so I'll put it to you another way. There's nothing to stop a landowner obtaining 10 resource consents. That could all simultaneously be there, and it's not usually regarded as acceptable to try and rank which one is better or worse. And so one of the ambiguities I took from your memo was the view that the consent notice was a better outcome than the proposal, and therefore that should be the one that's, because the proposal's not better than that, therefore that's one reason against it. And I'm concerned that that's not a very reliable factor for us. So I don't want you to try and artificially pretend there isn't a consent notice. What I'm trying to do is say, let's assume that wasn't a goalpost of the only thing that's acceptable. Would that change your view if we said it doesn't matter if we think the proposal is slightly better or slightly worse or otherwise?
No, I wouldn't. No. Cut short. Because you're still looking at, if you completely ignore, the consent notice conditions and looked at the site as it is, the context of the landscape, you're still looking at the site in its context, what's around it, how the development's happened, what's the character of rural residential development in the surrounding landscape, how this development fits into that. So I'm still considering that in that context. So I don't think it would change my.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Denny. And just the last, I said I'd only ask you one before going to Commissioner Caunter, so I suspect if she was here in person, she'd kick me under the table. But my last question then is, in terms of the view you've expressed that this would need substantial change before you'd be able to support it. I want to get my head around, is it the question that there's just too much building footprint and not enough open space as a literal measurement or in contiguous area? Or, for instance, if it was just a case in terms of visual character and effects that a substantial amount of the buildings just couldn't be seen, is the concern the visibility of the buildings, or fundamentally how they're laid out relative to the open spaces, almost as a two-dimensional plan matter?
It's a very hard proposal to assess in some regards. To me, there's a pattern of development throughout the subzone of Bob's Cove of a clearing within a forested area where you put a building, and it's a residential building. And the scale and context of that is, relatively consistent throughout the whole subdivision. This proposal it differs, and I said that in my addendum I've just sent through to you, is that it's a different sort of concept. It's a sort of a higher density of smaller buildings, and that absorbs a greater area of land to get the number of buildings they wish to get in there. And in doing so, it pushes the buildings right out to the very edge of the forest and in some places into it. So, and you end up with one larger collective development area. And to me, there's clear definition in the chapter 22 between in the subzone between undomesticated and domesticated areas. And the undomesticated areas, in this instance, is primarily the gully. So it's untouched, that'll take care of itself, it'll do its thing, and that's quite a natural context. Whereas once you cross that boundary into what the development area is, they're doing a lot of planting, which is good. But it's a different type of context. The planting is more managed and manicured, and it's more of a controlled environment. So those natural things that actually happen in those undomesticated areas won't happen in this area. And you've got a lot of potential conflict with buildings and people and all that sort of carry on. So it's a lot more controlled environment, trimming trees and all that sort of stuff. And because of that, you end up with this mass on the slope. And and to credit to the applicant, they've done a good job architecturally of each building of setting these things into the landscape, which is good. And the green roofs, they're fantastic. It's a great way to do it. And there's a lot of planting, but at the end of the day, the development area is larger across the slope, and I think that'll be visually apparent. In terms of character, it's apparent. But it is a hard one because they have done a lot within that development area to soften it. But to my mind, I think the scale of it, the mass of it, is too extensive for this site, for this landscape as such.
All right, thank you, Mr. Denny. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Were you saying something else?
No, you go.
Okay, I was just going to ask Commissioner Coulter if she had any questions for you.
I've just got one, Mr. Denny, thank you. In your report to Mr. O'Connell, so this is the latest one we've received, you've expressed some concerns about the achievement of the landscape outcomes and interestingly used the word reshuffling of a natural regenerating landscape, etc. So that's your third bullet point on page 4. I just wondered if you could just talk us through that a little bit more. I know some of this was in your original report, but it's been a wee while since I went back to that. So could you just take us through that, what your concerns are about the success or not success of the planting and so on?
Yeah, sure. I guess it's a hard one for an applicant to try and do mitigation, but also meet the desires of the development as such. And you see this a lot in developments where there's a lot of planning goes in to mitigate, but then the realistic nature of planning is that people want views, and on a site like this, you want a view of the lake. And so ultimately, and this has come up in hearings, and I think that some of the judges have commented on this, so that plantings in front of buildings needs to be, to a degree, realistic in terms of, is there an incentive to retain that vegetation, or is the incentive stronger to remove it for views or whatever? So, I mean, that is a concern. And looking at the planting plan, there's a lot of planting here in front of buildings. There's a lot of buildings tucked in the bush that won't potentially have a view. And so there's always going to be this pressure to get those views. And then in addition to that, planting close to buildings has its own hazards in terms of, branches falling and buildings bashed against buildings, and when you get high winds and stuff. This has now been opened as a larger clearing. And so potentially you get wind throw effects from trees that have been destabilised through construction, and even the transplanted trees, they won't have the root structure they originally had, they're going to be trimmed up. And so they'll need to be guided and stabilised in place so they could get to a point where they can get those roots down. But it's hard when you've got so much building and pathways and stuff to have the space for those trees to secure themselves. And the other thing is the fire risk thing. And most of the rural developments I'm looking at nowadays, the fire risk thing is quite a concern. And generally, I try to follow the Fire and Emergency New Zealand guidelines on rural safety and having those setbacks. And their setbacks, the general setbacks are 10-metre clearance zone around each building. And then you have your low flame building species from that. And then you have controls on leaf litter and clearing all the stuff. This site's, it's not doing that. It's building that's got planning hard up against buildings, and that's a concern. And we're relying on a dowsing system to cover that. But a lot of that vegetation is going to overhang rooftops and stuff like that. Plus, there's green roof stuff there too. I don't know how that goes in the fire, to be honest. But there's all that build up of leaf litter and all that sort of carry on, which is, an event that becomes a problem. It's more likely the trees are going to be modified or removed rather than the buildings. And as we move forward, dealing with climate change and all the rest of it, and the increasing population in the rural areas of the district, the chances of fire are increasing. And as we know, we've had a big fire just around the corner from this site that started on the beachfront. Basically, idiots having a barbecue on the beach, and it raced up the mountain slope quite quickly. And at the start of this year at Glendale Bay, we had another similar thing. It started on the beachfront of the lake. Again, idiots at the barbecue, and it got away and destroyed quite a large area of conservation land. It got very close to the golf course resort development out there at Glendale Bay. So it is a concern. My view for planning is that it needs to be robust and has some longevity down the track, that it's going to do its job in terms of mitigation and character setting. It's not so much the risk to buildings that's my concern. I'll leave that to other people. It's more what effect that has on planting. So that's I mean, they're proposing a lot of planning, which is good, but I think I do have concerns about, is it realistic long term?
Okay, I understand that. Okay. Just following up on Commissioner Munro's questions when you were talking about Chapter 22 of the proposed plan, I think I'm understanding you correctly, that what you're really saying through your answers to your questions and your report is that, in your view, Chapter 22 directs outcomes that are more closely aligned with what you're seeing at Bob's Cove at the moment. Is that right?
Yes, it'd be fair to say. Yeah, I mean, Bob's Cove's got its own subzone that's been detailed out in the district plan, has its own special character and values and all the rest. And the development to date has, the zone hasn't changed a great deal from the ODP, the subzone. And so the development to date is, consent development has followed that pattern. You can see that on the landscape. It's important to note out there that there is some variability in the zone. So you've got the subzone, and further to the western side of the bay, the subzone ends and you have the rural residential zone. And a little bit of this site down where the lower sort of by the beach there, there's also the rural residential area. So it's kind of a mixed zone. There's some sort of complication there, but the majority of the sites in the subzone, and I think that pattern's consistently shown throughout the development.
Okay. I think that was all I had, because my other questions were tied in with the chair's questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Denny, I just have one final follow-up for you, following on from Commissioner Cornter's question. One of the comments that Mr. Edmonds made when he was speaking to us as part of the applicant's presentation, and I thought it was to be frank, a very helpful comment and a very fair one, was he talked about the nature of the Bob's Cove zone and the existing pattern of dwellings that can be seen, and he drew the distinction of how the subzone itself changes its profile from the flatter, clearer valley up to a more bushed flank, including this site. And I'm interested in just getting you to tease out a bit further the extent to which we should be expecting something closer to those larger dwellings on more cleared vacant sites on the flatland, as opposed to what's happening in this more sloped bush section, and whether carving out large chunks of the bush to create flat, or not flat, but cleared areas around large houses, like big holes in the bush, is really the right thing to do, and is that really what the chapter seeks? So do you want to just reflect on that comment? You might disagree with Mr. Edmonds too, of course, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm not entirely sure what the question is. So can you rephrase that slightly, repeat it?
Commissioner Cornter was talking to you about whether or not you see Chapter 22 as seeking on this site something closer to what's already developed around Bob's Cove. And on that point, Mr. Edmonds talked about how a lot of that land is flatter, more naturally cleared or historically cleared. and that might be distinguishable from a more bushy, bush-clad sloped site. And so the question is, am I correctly understanding you that you see Chapter 22 as seeking more conventional, large, cleared areas with a house in the middle of them, which could visually look like holes in the bush with houses in them, which I think Mr. Edmonds was saying maybe that's an advantage of doing something a bit different on this site.
Yes, okay, gotcha. There's some variability in the subzone because, you know, it was cleared land and it was farmed, and there's references in the subzone chapter about pastoral context and stuff, which applies to the area adjacent to the main road. And a lot of those lots you see from the main road are in that pastoral context. There's some exotic hedges there, there's hawthorn and stuff, and then there's scattered stuff. So it's a bit thinner in those areas. So those bigger clearings are kind of were there from the start as such, and it's a bit of a flickering edge as such. Down by the beach side, this side here changes. It's much more intensive forest areas. I was trying to think back because I was involved in the 2013 consent a long time ago. And to what extent trees were removed. I don't think the scale of removal that's been consented today is large, and that the clearings are relatively small and the dominance of the vegetation around it remains. This site in itself is different because the majority of the site is cleared and the dominance of regenerating forest is reduced. And I know they're shuffling stuff around and whatever, but in terms of the natural process of ecological regeneration which occur on the south, it's been reduced. So there's a change there. Does that answer your question?
Well, it sort of does, but I'm content to take the sort of answer that you gave for the purposes of understanding how to approach the bush-clad parts of the subzone vis-a-vis this domesticated, undomesticated matter. So I don't need any further comments from you. I'm happy to
add something to that.
If it's more helpful than the last bit, yes.
I'll try to. Because the zone allows building development to go into each lot. In my mind, having a clearing of the building, and it gives you more of a buffer towards the surrounding protected area. And I think that's a good principle to follow, and it has been followed. The principle of going into such an area and clearing it on a larger extent and then replacing vegetation has a different outcome, which I think is a lesser outcome in some regard. Is that useful or not?
Oh, well, it clarifies your opinion and how you've approached things,
Yeah.
and it gives us context to how you've assessed it. So that is helpful in that respect. So, look, thank you, Mr. Denny. I don't have any other questions for you. I'll just make sure there's no follow-ups from Commissioner Cornton.
Nothing further from me, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Denny. Okay. Mr. O'Connell, we could move on to either of Mr. Errington or Mr. Hopkins if either is available.
Yeah, Mr. Errington is available. He's online. I'm still trying to get Mr. Hopkins. So if you want to move on to Mr. Errington, he's available.
Hi, Mr. Errington. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Hope you're well.
Fine, thank you very much.
Good, good.
Yep.
Sorry to hear you were unwell when the hearing occurred.
Yes, COVID struck, and yeah, still got the after effects, but getting through. Yeah.
Okay. In the first instance, where we got to was just after hearing from the applicant and the submitters, was just, as is the norm, asking the officers just to confirm whether their opinion has changed. Now, you weren't at the hearing, so I'm relying on trust that Mr. O'Connell has brought you sufficiently up to speed on what happened and where the application is at, such that you can confirm one way or the other whether your view has changed on the application.
Right. This is in terms of the transplanting of the existing trees, I'm guessing. Yeah.
Well, yes, and the extent beyond that, your professional assessment and opinion is relevant to the matters raised in Mr. O'Connell's recommendation to us.
Yep. No, I haven't changed on that. Transplanting, it's a recognised form of moving trees around. It's been done for over 100 years now around the world, and if done properly, and with care, it's a successful way of moving trees. The aftercare is crucial. I'm just looking at the aftercare plan presented by the tree moving company. That's a bit thin on the ground, but that can be covered by a relevant condition, just beefing it up a bit. So I've got no great concerns, nothing really shouts out.
All right, thank you for that. As it happens, I don't have any questions of you, but we'll just see if Commissioner Corner does.
I don't really have a question, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind doing this, Mr. Errington. It's a little unusual in a hearing, particularly involving such a lot of evidence about the transplanting of trees, just simply receive an email from somebody who is just called Tim, being sent to Mr. O'Connell. Would you mind sending through to Mr. O'Connell or to Trish Anderson, our hearing secretary, a document just telling us what your qualifications and experience is?
Certainly, yep.
Including any, degrees or certificates of whatever
By all
that
means.
you have, because there's just no information on that. We really need that on the record, please.
Okay, no, I'll get that through, yep.
Yeah, thank you. I've got nothing else because I understood the points that you'd made. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Mr. Errington. If you could just get that to Mr. O'Connell, ideally in the next few days, just so if the applicant does want to refer to it or comment on it in its right of reply, it's got ample time to do so.
Okay, will do, yeah.
All right, thank you. You are free to go back to enjoying whatever the weather is in your neck of the woods today.
Cheers, thanks very much.
All right. Mr. O'Connell.
Yes.
I am reluctant to put us all on an unspecified adjournment until we can find Mr. Hopkins. He did speak to us at the hearing, and the specific comment we'd be seeking from him now is just to confirm what the applicants and indeed you have told us is his agreement. We're doing this a little bit on the fly, and unusually I'm just going to have a discussion with Ms. Corner about it in front of everyone, but Jan, it seems to me on this discrete issue, we could just proceed with Mr. O'Connell and just ask Mr. Hopkins to submit a very short confirmatory statement in writing that what's been attributed to him by the applicant and Mr. O'Connell is indeed his opinion. Seems to be relatively straightforward.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. O'Connell, that's what we'll do. So if you can please just get in touch with him and just get him to confirm something in writing that can be circulated to the applicant as well and confirmed on the record. I'm happy to just proceed on that basis, and I don't have any other questions of him relating to the wastewater side of things. And again, we broadly discussed that with him at the hearing.
Just on that, I do have an email from Mr. Hopkins that does confirm that. I apologise, I should have.
Really? All right,
yeah.
well, it may be that's
Sorry, I
completely
apologise for
satisfactory.
that.
Oh, you don't need to apologise. Yeah, you've been unwell too. So we're all just, everyone's doing their best.
Yeah, if I may, I'll just read a bit of that he does say, therefore, in his opinion, that the on-site treatment and disposal appears feasible on the subject site, and this will be my recommendation to council processing planner. Okay. Well, let's maybe just flick him an email now telling him I'm sure he's madly rushing to try and join the hearing because he was asked to. Maybe tell him we've figured it out, and he can go back to doing his other work. I will, because he's got about 12 missed calls from me, so I might. Yes, okay, all right. Thank you. And in the meantime, Mr. O'Connell, we can just turn to you. Look, thank you for providing in writing that summary of what we've got to. Perhaps the best thing to do is just for you just to speak to any of the key summary points you want to from that, and then we'll go to questions. Yeah, okay. Just in terms of the structure of my summary, the first points A through F were just responding to some of the discussions that were had at the hearing, and I felt that may assist the Commission just in terms of my position and understanding of some of that. And then I thought it was useful to go back to my original recommendations and just note how they had changed. One of the key changes is obviously the wastewater being resolved. That was a major concern of mine, as through my 42A report. Likewise, the access issue. Now, in my 42A report, I took the position that the applicant had actually provided that in the application they noted that the subject site only had access for 4 users and that they were in negotiation to get that resolved. So I adopted that in my 42A report. Obviously, legal submission from the applicant at the hearing changed that position. And as I said in my summary, that's a legal matter and it's outside my area of expertise. So I'm not going to comment on that specifically, but in my summary, the 2 key things, I've changed my recommendation and that's based on obviously the evidence submitted and discussions at the hearing. And I obviously gave that considerable consideration. And the key one was getting the wastewater resolved, and that change of recommendation is on two premises, if you like. One is that the access is legal. Obviously, if they don't have access, then in my opinion, the district plan requires that access is provided to developments, and if it hasn't got access, then that's in my 42A report opinion would stand. The other one is around conditions, and this goes back to Mr. Denny's report and comments around the feasibility of the outcome that's been achieved. And so whilst I've changed my recommendation, it is on the basis that the access is achievable and that we get these conditions right. And picking up on a point that was discussed earlier on, council and the applicant are working really well together on the conditions. We've got engineering resolved, we've got noise resolved, we've got environmental management plans resolved. We're now down to some of the wording around the landscape conditions, and we're not far apart. The intent is pretty close, and it's just getting that wording right. So a couple of the key parts of my report and my summary. Once wastewater and if access is resolved, that resolved a lot of my other issues in my report, such as precedent, such as a gateway test, such as Section 106. So a lot of that fell away subsequent to that new evidence coming forward. And that's when I then drilled down probably deeper into the Section 104 assessment. And that's probably, in my mind, one of the key matters is the Section 104. And my summary was very much that, a summary. And that was due to my concentration levels. I did struggle a little bit with that. But I talk about how I step back and reevaluate the application from the time that my 42A was circulated to now, and the changes taken into account the revised landscape plan that was submitted at the end of last week, and Mr. Denny's advice as well that over time the effects, there will be a softening of the effects, and that over time it'll reduce to a lower than moderate effect. I think Mr. Denny concludes. So when I step back and look at the proposal as a whole, as the role of council officer and what the outcomes anticipated through the district plan, and particularly looking at positive effects from this proposal, such as the positive biodiversity effects which will come in through the site, and also in particular the predator control plan, which will have benefits beyond just this application site and the wider environment, but also given the conservation land right next door, it's going to have a lot of benefits for that. Sorry, just need to. But then I also reflected on the nature of the activity and some of the controls that this activity is going to have, which are probably slightly unusual for visitor accommodation, particularly around no public access to the sort of communal facilities, the restaurant and the sauna and the spa and things like that. And in my mind, that's a really key control, because it takes away some of the effects that we often see when visitor accommodation, particularly in an urban setting, around traffic movements and noise and things like that late at night, and people coming and going, and it will control the scale of any sort of functions or weddings or conferences, things like that, because the facilities are only available to the guests on site, and that's a condition of consent that the applicant and council have already agreed, and we've already got that in the draft conditions of consent. So that gives me a good level of confidence that the nature of the activity has been carefully thought through to minimise those effects. Getting noise resolved, obviously that wasn't resolved in my 42A, but subsequently evidence through that has been resolved, and both experts agree, and we've got the conditions locked in over that as well. The location of the site was something else that I took into account, and I picked up on this from Mr. Edmonds' evidence. We're not wanting to use the word tucked away, but it is a bit tucked away. It is in a more isolated area of the subzone, and there are benefits having the conservation land around the boundaries and the big gully, because that creates and will maintain separation from residential properties, which will never be able to be encroached in on because of those ownership. So those were some of the key things. And then I was also mindful that the plan does anticipate development on the site. And the plan, earthworks and residential development on the site. So it's different than another site, which may be a rural site or something like that, where the scale of development isn't necessarily anticipated. I might just refer to my notes now because I had a list of things here. The design of the buildings is noted by Mr. Denny was another thing when I looked at the application as a whole. Not having public access to the facilities cuts down a lot of that traffic movement on the Glen Tui Drive, which in my opinion is quite a key difference or factor for this one as well. So those were some of the key reasons when I was looking at the application as a whole. I looked at the objectives and policies, stepped back and looked through them more closely, and having wastewater and assuming access is okay, then there's, in my opinion, the proposal is inconsistent with some objectives and policies, but not contrary to. And I will just touch on my second point B, where I just talk about the structure of my objectives and policies, because that was noted at the hearing. The applicant provided a comprehensive assessment of objectives and policies, about 34 pages. So rather than just repeating that, I adopted the ones which I agreed with. And I did agree with their assessment in terms of the objectives and policies in Chapter 22. However, I would note that, in my opinion, policy 22.2.2.1, and I apologise that I haven't noted this in my summary, that is the policy that talks about enabling various activities, including visitor accommodation, which in terms of the location, scale, type, are compatible with and enhance the predominant activities of the relevant zone. In my opinion, the applicants concluded that the proposal would be consistent with that. I would say that it's inconsistent with that, but not contrary to, because it doesn't have the predominant activities in the relevant zone are residential, and this doesn't have residential a residential component, but it's the location and scale and type. In my opinion, it achieves those criteria, not completely, but to a degree that I wouldn't conclude that it's contrary to. And likewise for Chapter 22.2.25, that policy, 22.2.23, which says which is the reverse, which says discourage a range of activities, including visitor accommodation, that would diminish amenity values and the quality and character of the living environment. I'd say that it's inconsistent with that, but not contrary to, and I would rely on Mr. Denny's advice to a degree there, that there will be adverse effects in terms of the character and quality of the environment. And just one last point that I'll pick up, which has been discussed today, is Mr. Denny has raised concerns about the practicality of achieving some of the outcomes. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that in a planning context. And I step back to almost like the first principles of planning, is that the applicant has submitted a proposal that we're now considering, which they have said will achieve outcomes. And as an officer, we have to see if these outcomes are achievable. They have experts that say they will be achievable. And this is where the importance of getting the drafting of the conditions right is very important in my mind. And that is what we're working on at the moment to ensure that the outcomes that have been submitted or the applicant says they will achieve can be achieved. And I am mindful that if they're not achieved in the future, then there are avenues that the applicant will be required to go down to ensure that they are achieved, and through either variations of consents or through compliance of conditions of consent. I think they are my main. Oh, the last point. My points D, E, and F of my summary. A response to the questioning in the at the hearing on the Thursday around what is the anticipated environment, what is the starting point, and I acknowledge, and I want to be upfront and acknowledge that in my report, my Section 42A report, I did say that the 2013 consent was the starting point, and I should have been more reflective on that, and having listened to the evidence and reconsidered that, it is a starting point, a possible starting point. The district plan objectives and policies and rules are the starting point for assessment. I am aware, though, that this is not just a land use consent, it's a subdivision consent and a consent under Section 221 to vary consent notices. And in my opinion, I find the rules are slightly unusual in my experience of having dealt with rules on various districts in New Zealand. It's very unusual, in my opinion, to see rules that refer to previous resource consents or subdivision consents, and also in the interpreting the rules section, essentially saying that even if you've got a permitted activity, it doesn't absolve any commitment to the conditions of even a relevant land use consent, consent notice, or covenants. Now, so in my opinion, that is it's an unusual planning framework. Because it reverts back to that. So they were the points that I was just making in D, E, and F in my summary.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mr. O'Connell. Commissioner Corter, do you have any questions?
I've just got a couple of points, Mr. O'Connell. Just let me find them, though. When I read your report, I got a little confused, I have to say. So this is your latest report, not the first one. Mainly because the way that you had encapsulated Mr. Denny's comments didn't seem to me to quite reflect what Mr. Denny was saying. And so you sort of picked, for example, some comments about his, the long-term benefits of the planting and how it might take 15 years and all that sort of thing. But there were lots of other points in Mr. Denny's feedback to you that, to me, reflected a much greater concern, and he has just really confirmed that this morning in the points he's made. So when I got to the section of your report that basically said you didn't really think there was a problem and the integrity of the plan wasn't affected, I wasn't really joining the dots, and I'm still not. So I just wondered if you wanted to talk to that, because you've just said in your comments now that you don't think that the proposal is contrary to a couple of the policies, but you do think it's inconsistent with them. So we're still going around a little bit of a circle, I think. I do understand the point you're making in terms of what those policies are saying and what your view of that is, but I don't quite then get to the last bit, which is what does that do to precedent and integrity of the plan arguments. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, I can. And I acknowledged your point and your question. When I reviewed Mr. Denny's advice, and obviously I talked at length with Mr. Denny about his position and his advice, and he's explained it here again today. And my summary was very much that a summary, and when I went back and reread that last comment, I should have probably expanded on that a little. However, I paid particular attention to Mr. Denny's paragraph 12 of his assessment, and he talks about, and I accept Mr. Denny's advice. I'm not going against Mr. Denny's advice. It's a balancing of the various aspects of this application that I was undertaking at Section 104B. The activity, in my opinion, will not have significant adverse effects. There are some aspects that will be more than minor, at potentially more than minor, and it's not contrary to objectives and policies in my opinion. So therefore, and then when I take into account in terms of precedent, the specific question there, when I look at those other factors which I detailed around the location of the site and things like that, in my opinion, there's sufficient uniqueness, if you like, about this activity and about this site and about the proposal as a whole, which would not be able to be, which would not set an unacceptable precedent. So it's, in terms of the precedent issue, it wasn't just around Mr. Denny's advice, it was stepping back and looking at the application as a whole, and that's how I landed with my precedent. In terms of Mr. Denny's, he is very clear that he considers that a more fundamental, I think he uses the term, a more fundamental change to the extent and form of the undomesticated and domesticated areas is, in his opinion, what is required here. However, he does talk about, and he does advise that over time, and if the trees are planted, and I'm just reading, so that's why my eyes are down, I've got it highlighted here, that there will start to form canopies over the buildings, and we'll start to form that character and that landscape, which will be more in line with what the plan anticipates, and it won't have the big gaps, obviously, that Mr. Denny is in his opinion, his outcome that he seeks, and he does talk it will start to soften, or partly soften the domestication of this area through time, and particularly the higher trees, the transplanting of the 51 trees, but also I think there's another 236 trees shown on that plan, or plants shown on that plan, and a lot of them are the beech trees, which are really high. So I didn't just cherry pick the bit of the advice that suited a position. I looked at that advice as a whole, but then I took that advice and I looked at it in the context of the whole application as well, and positive effects and things. And I was more reflective, if I'm being honest, in terms of 104B. I spent a lot of time reflecting on that and considering that in this instance. So I adopt Mr. Denny's advice, and I accept that he is not. He considers more is needed to get to a landscape opinion, a view in his opinion. So, but when I look at the application, as I said, as a whole, I didn't cherry pick, but I use the term finely balanced, and I don't often use that term, but I think in this case it is a finely balanced recommendation, because there's many moving parts to this. Excuse me, I just need it. One of the side effects of my COVID is I get dehydrated very quickly, but there's a lot of moving parts to this, and we've got cultural effects also sitting there as well, which I haven't changed my view on that, and I'm not an expert in that area as well, so I was very careful when I drafted my 42A to look at it from a planning perspective, the cultural effects, but there's a lot of moving parts to this, because there's the wastewater system to go in on site, there's the earthworks to get the tanks and the buildings and the structures, and then the overlaying of the landscaping and getting the landscaping right and the trees right. So my recommendation is, as I said, based on a couple of key factors. One is access, but also getting those conditions right to ensure that we are satisfied that the outcome is achievable, and is monitored, is able to be measured, and compliance can be achieved. So I'm not sure if I might have gone off topic a little bit there, but does that assist?
Well, it sort of assists in explaining how you got to the answer. Because we haven't got the conditions, it's quite difficult for us to. I can't really follow through with you on that, because I don't know what the conditions are saying. So it's kind of I don't think there's too much I can really follow up with on that. And well, don't go through them in any way, because we really need to have a look at them.
Okay.
And get them now for another couple of weeks. But let me just put this to you. In your answer, I'm pretty sure you said that you did still consider, or Mr. Denny considered, there were some effects that were more than minor. And if that's the case, how do you then get through the first threshold of section 104D, which you've said that you can pass through. I'm just.
I've made an error. I apologise. I've made an error. You don't get through the first gateway test because there's a fair bit more than minor. So I apologise. I've made an error in that summary, but because it's not contrary to, in my opinion, not contrary to objectives and policies, that passes a second gateway test. So discretion is still available. So yeah, that's an error on my part.
No, that's fine. That's why I was just checking. That's the point of this exercise.
Yeah, it's pretty much so.
Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there. I did have some other things I did want to talk to you about, but I really, we haven't got these conditions that you're all working on, and I don't think there's any point in going there, really. So I'll leave it to the chair, see what he's got to say.
Thanks, Mr. O'Connell. The only question I want to ask really follows up on that second 104D limb, the contrariness test. And I appreciate the distinction you've drawn between inconsistent and contrary, and understand contrariness is about the plan as a whole, not a couple of, as you say, cherry-picked provisions. But I want to talk further with you and get a better understanding of your view on Chapter 22 in two respects. The first is the extent to which, if visitor accommodation is a discretionary activity in the first instance, does that mean it should still be designed in a way that looks like big detached houses on cleared sites, vis-a-vis a typical residential outcome? Or does it provide, in that inconsistency rather than contrariness space, for something that could have a very different character, because the activity is provided for as a discretionary activity in the zone?
Looking at the objectives and policies, and I'm looking at another screen, so apologies for not looking directly at you. It is a discretionary activity, and there's two limbs, those two policies that I talked about, 22.2.1 and 22.2.3. There's two limbs to each of them. One of them talks about enabling certain, visitor accommodation. One talks about discouraging it. But the second limb of that, and that's where I get to it's inconsistent with, talks about in terms of the location, scale, and type, community are compatible with and enhance predominant activities on the zone. So that's about that's in my opinion about the activity, but it talks about location and scale, and it comes down to what scale is. Is that talking about the scale of the activity in terms of the number of people able to use the visitor accommodation, or the scale of buildings? Now, the zone has other built form standards such as site coverage and height, which will control how a building, the size of the building on the site. So in my opinion, visitor accommodation as a discretionary activity is the plan is still anticipating that it will have a built form. I'll use the term scale and size, built form consistent with the zone, because there isn't specific zone rule. The standard zone rules in terms of built form apply to that activity as well. So in my opinion, and that is reflected in those two policies.
So just to be clear, your view is that you take those policy words, scale and location, and you look at the zone standards that relate to those matters, yards, height, building coverage, etc. And with reference to those, your view is the proposal can be regarded as still being in that range of outcomes that the policy talks about.
Yes, my view is it's at most inconsistent with, but it is within the range of the outcomes, because they have met, they do exceed the height. Some of the units do exceed height, not by a great amount. They're all single story, they're set into the site. So in terms of this, and site coverage and those sorts of things. So in the broader sense, yes, I in my view, from the planning framework in terms of the built form standards, the proposal broadly sits within those objectives and policies.
Okay. The second thing related to that is the the matter that was discussed with Mr. Denny, and it's the domesticated versus undomesticated, and what does that mean? And I think Mr. Denny gave comments to the effect of, albeit with a lot of vegetation proposed near and in conjunction with the buildings, they would still have a domesticated rather than undomesticated character, and therefore the balance of the site that was undomesticated was just too much. I'd have to say I think that could be, while being clear, Commissioner Cornter and I are nowhere near reaching a view on the matter, that could be one topic that I could see leading to a question of contrariness, certainly in terms of Chapter 22 at that sort of more fundamental level. So I'm keen to get your thoughts on what you think domesticated and undomesticated refer to, and whether you share Mr. Denny's concerns.
The plan defines domesticated and undomesticated areas, and very clear about that. I do share Mr. Denny's concerns that the development has spread across the site, as opposed to more clearly defined areas within the site, and the consent notice shows an example of what that could be, that outcome could be. When I was balancing the plan's intention to have clearly defined areas of development and undomesticated areas which are planted out in indigenous vegetation that has a closed canopy, etc. I was mindful of the extent of landscaping across the site. So there is, in my opinion, a way to achieve that potentially without necessarily having those clearly defined areas. But I do agree with Mr. Denny that that the development has extended out beyond, to the edges of the site, if you like, and encapsulates pretty much the whole site, as opposed to having more distinctive areas.
And so it follows, and I can see the connection that the view you've just expressed leads you to the at most inconsistency rather than contrariness.
Yeah, and the reason for that, for example, if the extent of landscaping, if the 51 trees weren't necessarily proposed across the entire site, which will provide that structure and that height, and I'm very mindful not to step into a landscape space here, it's outside my expertise, so this is in a planning context. If those factors that I talked about in terms of the design of the buildings, the low profile, noting a couple are higher, and the extent of landscaping across the entire site is an alternative way to achieve the outcome sought by the plan. In my opinion, the plan is anticipating something more defined and definitive in terms of development areas, clearly marked undomesticated areas. However, this alternative proposal that's been put for us, in my opinion, sufficiently meets enough of the criteria to be inconsistent with but not contrary to.
Okay, that's understood. Thank you. I don't have any other questions for you. But what I want to do is make the possibly unusual step of suggesting that at this time, we should probably and properly categorise your change of position as being one of supporting the grant of consent in principle. And I'm saying in principle because for all we know, the applicant might completely disagree with whatever conditions of consent you and your colleagues might come up with to substantiate that recommendation. And that still has to happen, and we don't have that. So, Mr. Leckie, I hope you don't have a concern with what I've just stated and characterised there.
No concern, and understand the need for that proviso, if you like. Yeah. So
we're in a bit of an unusual space because when we sort of went on this process of adjourning, at least in terms of the positions of the officers, the expectation was that they would assist and provide commentary to conditions of consent that would ultimately still be the applicant's conditions of consent were we minded to agree with the case and grant consent. Now we're in a slightly different position of the officers indicating that they could be supportive of a grant of consent subject to conditions. And those conditions might not be the conditions the applicant might prefer. And I don't then want to end up in a state where I then get a series of evidence statements debating differences of conditions. So I think, and again, we're doing this a bit on the hop, and Commissioner Cornter, you might want to contribute or disagree with me or lead to us going offline for a bit. But it seems to me what might be needed in the first instance is for Mr. O'Connell and his colleagues to actually put together the conditions of consent that they are thinking would need to be imposed to support the grant of consent. Then I think, Mr. Leckie, you would have an opportunity as part of your reply to work through those, make any comments or disagreements or alternatives or additions that the applicant feels we should be doing, and then you could attach to that reply whatever the markup set the applicant would prefer. And then I think Commissioner Cornter and I would have a very clear basis of officer support, and we would have a very clear set of reasons and responses from your client's perspective as to what it would seek. Commissioner Cornter, does that sound reasonable and acceptable to you?
Sounds fine to me, thank you.
Yes. Mr. Leckie, does that sound agreeable to you?
Yeah, no, that sounds sensible. I agree that we're in a slightly unusual situation if we don't know what we don't know yet in terms of the detail, but I do take some comfort in terms of process that there has been a lot of work done already. So although I appreciate the commissioners don't have a document in front of them at this stage, I'm feeling fairly comfortable that by the time we can come back to you with closing, we will have a relatively clear position, at least certainly from the applicant's perspective, but hopefully that's a relatively aligned position with council. So yeah, that's fine. And the last thing that we want to do is sort of come back to you with Gray. I think it's important that we have a clear applicant position and make clear if there's any points of disagreement as well.
Okay, Mr. O'Connell.
Yes.
If we were to proceed on the basis of outlines where the first step would be, I expect you to produce the conditions of consent that you would require to maintain your support of the grant of consent. What time frame do you think you would need? And of course, you'd be free to discuss with your colleagues and the applicant's colleagues as part of preparing that. But what time frame do you think you'd need for that?
It depends on how much correspondence with the applicant that I require. The applicant and the council are, as I said, we're down to the wording of some of the landscape conditions, which are the important ones. My change of position is in that. Ideally, we would be able to have that to you prior to the legal submissions being submitted.
Well, what we need is I would probably struggle to put much weight in an officer recommendation to grant with conditions if the officers didn't have any conditions.
We have conditions, right? Yeah. I guess what. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
What I think you're saying is that you've got conditions, and you think with a bit of time, it's possible that agreement could be reached with the applicant.
Yeah,
that's
I've got
fine.
Conditions. Yeah, so I have conditions, and the applicant and I, we've met a number of times working through those conditions, and rather than submitting the conditions, just saying this is what council thinks. My position was, let's try and get the applicant. If the council and the applicant agree, then that's a much better outcome, because then we know.
Yes.
So I have conditions, but I guess I was liaising with the applicant as well, as opposed to just putting the council's position forward.
What I think the process probably needs, and the submitters too, is you say you've got those conditions already.
In draft form, yeah.
I think in the first instance, even if it's draft, I think it's important that the officers release the conditions that are supporting the recommendations they're giving us. And then the ongoing process you've referred to of as part of the applicant's response, are there tweaks that you would be agreeable with? I think that can proceed along the basis of Mr. Leckie's 2-week timeframe that he indicated up front. But I think definitely in the first instance, we need some marker in the sand to support the recommendation you've given today. And clearly you've got those, albeit
Yes.
draft. So what we can do for the purpose of the hearing is just record verbally that you are in a position where you have working conditions, and I don't think you're indicating that they are defective or limited from your point of view. It's just that there might be an agreeable alternative that the applicant also is happy with. Is that right?
Yes, correct, yeah.
So what I think we can do is just get you to circulate those conditions and just call them Nathan O'Connell's recommended conditions, 2nd November 2022. And you could put a line, a subheading to the effect of ongoing discussions will occur with the applicant as part of its right of reply and response, so that there's a clear understanding of the context of the conditions. And Mr. Leckie, that means we don't need to think about providing any additional time to the 2-week program you'd indicated. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's how I see it. And I'm in the event that something unexpected happens, I can always file a memorandum,
Of course,
seeking further directions or what have you. Yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Cornter, are you comfortable still with that?
Yes, I'm all fine. And I do want to just reiterate what you've just been saying so that Mr. O'Connell's clear, is that it's really important that we understand what your recommendation, given its change quite substantially, is based on.
Yeah.
So,
Yes,
okay.
would I be able to have till Friday just to put them together? I've got them all together. It's just in terms of symptoms from COVID, I'm not working.
Okay.
So I can have them to Friday. I've got them with me. Mr. Denny's provided has all my engineering and everyone, so I've got them. I just want to make sure they're collated.
Look, Mr. O'Connell, I don't see any issue with that. Mr. Leckie, regardless of Mr. O'Connell's request for Friday, my suggestion was already going to be, do we set a 2-week time frame, being Friday the 18th of November, which would have already built in the gap between now and this Friday anyway.
I'd round it up to that Friday as well. So I think we're all on the same page.
All right. So why don't we say, Mr. O'Connell, for the purpose of a clear and unambiguous time frame, you will provide no later than close of business this Friday, the 4th of November, the council's current recommended set of conditions.
Yes.
And Mr. Leckie, by close of business Friday, the 18th of November, we would be expecting a right of reply from yourself in writing with whatever changes or markups to the conditions of consent that are part of that. Mr. O'Connell, if at that time the conditions of consent have been varied and you are in agreement with them, we would also seek a very simple statement from you to the effect that you've been working with the applicant's people and the conditions attached to Mr. Leckie's reply, version X, dated whatever, are agreeable to the council, or words to that effect, just so we will know on writing, in writing, that if Mr. Leckie says you're agreed, we can verify that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, if that is the agreed pathway forward, I will thank everyone for reassembling this morning. These Zoom hearings are never as good as being in person in terms of the technology breakdowns and that sort of thing. To the applicant's team, Mr. McIntosh, Mr. Skelton, just to record, we see you there. Hello.
Thank you.
We had no role for you, but we acknowledge that you've taken time out too, and we look forward to receiving things in writing. And Mr. Leckie, of course, as you say, if anything varies, just fire through a memorandum and we'll address it that way.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah,
all right, thank you, folks. We will at that point adjourn the hearing.
Thank you.
And we'll be in
Thank
touch.
you.
Thank you.